This is an analysis from Alpha Business Media. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating story, Nepal's quest for its very first billion-dollar startup.
You know, when you think of Nepal, what comes to mind? Probably the Himalayas, right? These towering, incredible peaks. But what's happening right now is that a whole new generation is conquering a completely different kind of summit, and that's tech entrepreneurship. Deep inside the busy offices of Kathmandu, there's this quiet revolution going on, and it's turning this iconic landscape into a seriously dynamic startup hub. So just how big is this transformation?
Well, the scale of it can pretty much be captured in one single powerful number, 5x. So what does that mean? Well, that 5x represents an explosion in the number of startups. We're talking from just about 300 back in 2015 to over 1,500 by 2023. The energy is it's undeniable. But it begs a really important question. With all this growth, all this activity, where's Nepal's first billion-dollar company? You know, its first unicorn. And this is where things get interesting. It's a bit of a paradox. Even with this startup boom, the ecosystem itself isn't quite keeping up. In fact, Nepal actually slipped down to 107th in the global startup rankings. It points to what you might call a maturity gap. Basically, you have a ton of great ideas, but the infrastructure needed to support them, we're talking capital, talent, and regulation, it's all playing catch-up. Okay, so where is all this energy actually going? Well, this innovation isn't just happening randomly. It's really concentrated in a few key areas that are tackling some of Nepal's biggest local problems head-on. And if you look at the breakdown, it makes perfect sense. Fintech is huge because it's all about financial inclusion in places where traditional banking just can't reach. Then you have Edtech, which is stepping in to fill some pretty critical gaps in the education system. And of course, the software and data sector, that's tapping into the global demand for IT services, which brings in some really valuable foreign currency. But look, the path to building a billion-dollar company is never a straight line. It's more like an obstacle course. So let's talk about the three major hurdles that are really slowing down Nepal's hunt for that first unicorn. First up, and this is a big one, capital is scarce. Nepal has a traditionally conservative investment culture. What that means is local investors, the banks, they've always felt safer putting their money into tangible things, like real estate, instead of taking those high-risk, long-term bets that tech startups absolutely need to survive. Second, and this one is maybe the most critical challenge of all, talent is leaving. The best developers, the top engineers, they're getting snapped up by foreign companies for high-paying remote jobs. This phenomenon creates a shallow talent pool for the local startups who are trying to build their own world-class products. And number three, the regulations are just outdated. The legal rulebook hasn't kept up with the speed of technology. So what you get is this really challenging environment full of legal gray areas and a ton of red tape for new companies, especially if you're in a disruptive space like ride-sharing or fintech. And yet, despite all those challenges, you can see the signs of a major shift happening. If you look at the decade between 2012 and 2022, the IT sector was the absolute leader when it came to the number of investment deals. That tells you something huge. Even with that conservative culture, the smart, professional money is starting to wake up to the potential of tech. So who's driving this shift? It's a new class of professional investors. We're talking about impact funds like Dolma and private equity or VC firms like Business Oxygen. And what they're doing is so much more than just writing checks. They're basically professionalizing the entire ecosystem, making it less risky, and proving to everyone that yes, you can make successful tech investments in Nepal. But let's circle back to that talent problem, because it is absolutely fundamental. This virtual export of talent, what it really means is that if you're a local startup, your biggest competitor for a great engineer isn't the startup down the street. No. It's a global outsourcing firm that can pay 2, maybe 3 times the local salary. This is the real battle for resources happening in Nepal's tech scene right now. But even with all these headwinds, you always get heroes. So let's take a look at some of the trailblazers, the companies that are proving it's absolutely possible to build breakthrough businesses in Nepal against all odds. Let's start with Kathmandu. You have to picture this. Back in 2010, the idea of online food delivery in Nepal was basically science fiction. The founder, Manohar Adhikari, was met with total disbelief, and the company lost money for years. On top of that, they survived a devastating earthquake and an economic blockade. But through just sheer grit and some smart investment,
they did something incredible. They didn't just build a company. They built an entire industry from scratch and completely changed how people in Kathmandu live and eat.
Or how about the battle for the digital wallet? It's a classic story. You have Isawa, the pioneer. They spent a whole decade basically building the market all by themselves, educating users, building trust from zero. Then, in 2017, along comes Kalti, the challenger. They walked into a market that was already warmed up, and they hit it with aggressive, modern marketing tactics. And what that did was force the entire fintech space to get better, to innovate faster.
Okay, so the potential is clearly there. These trailblazers have shown us the way. The big question now is, how does the entire ecosystem grow up? Well, the analysis points to a pretty clear 4-step roadmap. First, you've got to reform the laws. Get a modern Startup Act on the books to give everyone some certainty. Second, you have to connect the universities with the business world. That means putting incubators right on campus, turning them into idea factories. Third, to fight that brain drain, you have to support your local IT champions so they can offer competitive salaries and keep top talent in the country. And finally, you change the whole investment culture by making a huge deal out of successful exits. You show everyone that yes, startups are a real, viable way to make money.
So here's the key takeaway. Nepal's first unicorn probably isn't going to be some flashy app that's just copying a global trend. No, it's much more likely to come from a company that spends the next decade patiently, systematically building the infrastructure to solve a really fundamental domestic problem, something in logistics or agriculture tech or finance.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. This whole quest for a unicorn, it isn't really just about hitting $1 billion valuation. The real question is, what kind of ecosystem gets built along the way? Will it be mature, resilient, and uniquely Nepali? The climb to that summit, it's really just getting started.